Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
For those of you who have been with us throughout this very stimulating symposium, I give you a badge of honor for going into this final evening session. For those of you who are new, it's been a very rewarding time discussing America's drug policy with so many distinguished speakers. At this time, we come to the plenary panel for life after the war on drugs. We have a very distinguished panel with us tonight. I'll give you just a brief introduction. Some of them you know very well at the D.C. College of Law family. First is our own Joseph Rao, distinguished professor of law, Wade Henderson. He is the president and the CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and he has been an outstanding leader in the community for civil rights for well over 5 decades. Expertise on wide-ranging civil rights and public policy issues. I'm counting the time now.
He was a teenage leader, I guess.
He was an agitator in college, as well as when he was an agitator in high school. And he's also my very beloved dear friend. And he's the author of numerous articles on civil rights and public policy issues. Since taking the helm of the Leadership Conference in 1996, Mr. Henderson has worked diligently to address emergency policy issues of concern to civil and human rights, both in the United States as well as worldwide, and to strengthen the effectiveness of the coalition. During his tenure, the Leadership Conference has become one of the nation's most effective advocates for civil and human rights. And now, the Leadership Conference consists of what, Wade, over 200 organizations. Is that correct? Yes, that's right. Next, in order in which they're going to speak, I introduce you to Jasmine Tyler, who is the Deputy Director for the National Affairs and Drug Policy Alliance. Ms. Tyler advocates for the policies that reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system, increase access to social and health services, and treat people who use drugs with dignity. Her work has included grassroots and grass tops organizing across the political spectrum, public speaking, and media appearance. She is one of the leaders of the Practice of Disparity Coalition, which you heard about today. She works to equalize the penalties for crack and powder cocaine. Her work led directly to the federal crack cocaine sentencing reform in 2010, including the first elimination of the mandatory minimum penalty since the 1970s. Her writing has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, The Economist, Huntington Post, and other national media outlets. Prior to joining the DPA, Jasmine worked as a research director for the Justice Policy Institute. And following Jasmine, and to your far left, is Mark Osler, a professor at the St. Thomas University School of Law in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Mr. Osler served as the lead counsel in Spears versus the United States, a 2009 case where the Supreme Court held that sentencing judges are permitted to categorically reject the federal sentencing guidelines. The 100-to-1 disparity between offenses involving crack and powder cocaine. Mr. Osler deserves a badge of courage for that great decision that restored the discretion in federal judges under Article 3 to their sentencing authority. Mr. Osler argues that judges must incorporate uniformly in discretion during sentencing and is a proponent of trailing edge guidelines. Thank you very much for joining us today, Mr. Osler. And next we have, without any real need for an introduction in this area at least, for those who know, the Honorable Arthur L. Burnett, Sr., National Executive Director of the National African American Drug Policy Coalition, D.C., and a professor of Howard University School of Law. Judge Burnett's record of accomplishments spans over 4 decades, and since August 2004, Judge Burnett has served almost full-time as the National Executive Director of the National African American Drug Policy Coalition. He also serves as a member of the American Bar Association Steering Committee on the unmet legal needs of children and is actively involved in the ABA's work on the various criminal justice issues, including wrongful convictions, sentencing, and reentry, and illegal drug use. He has been a drum major for justice and drug reform, and particularly he has been an outstanding member of the judiciary to speak to this issue. And last but certainly not least at all is Dr. Faye Taxman, the Director for the Center for Advancing Correctional Excellence and a professor at George Mason University. Dr. Taxman is recognized for her work in developing the seamless systems of care models that links criminal justice and community-based service delivery systems, as well as for her work towards reforming probation and parole supervision services. Dr. Taxman's work covers the breadth of the adult and juvenile correction systems, including jails, prisons, and community correction agencies. Dr. Taxman has collaborated on research with entities including the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the Maryland Division of Probation and Parole. Ladies and gentlemen, we're in for an exciting debate tonight. In closing out this wonderful symposium, and to lead in this discussion, I invite my dearly beloved brother and colleague, Wade Henderson, to deliver the keynote.
John, thanks for that great introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
Good evening. Honored to be with you. I understand you've had quite an interesting day, a challenging day. I understand the symposium was quite excellent. I'm sorry that I couldn't be here for it. I want to acknowledge this great panel that you've assembled after my presentation. And I want to apologize to my colleagues. I have a dinner this evening that requires me to leave before I'll have a chance to hear your panel. I'm very sorry about that, but I'm glad it's being recorded, and I know you will do justice to the topic at hand. And lastly, I want to thank the audience. This is an important subject. It's a subject that is not one that attracts a wide audience, of people who are necessarily committed to change. But the fact that you all have devoted your time, both today and this evening, I think speaks volumes about your interest and your commitment to these issues. Now, I can't think of a more appropriate educational institution to host this discussion than the University of the District of Columbia's David A. Clark School of Law. This is one of the few law schools in the nation with a mission of enabling students to be effective and ethical advocates for the needs of low-income people in particular and the public interest in general. It attracts committed people as faculty, as students, and as speakers at events such as this. Now, as we meet today, we can almost hear the voices of two extraordinarily brilliant, unusually dedicated, and let's not deny it, occasionally quite difficult, advocates for those who have few friends in high places. Neither of these leaders lived by the Washington watchwords, "Go along together." But because they refuse to go along with injustice, our country has moved further along our rocky but righteous road in the journey toward the timeless goal of liberty and justice for all. A native Washingtonian, a civil rights activist, a lawyer, and a law professor, Dave Clark was a strong advocate for a public law school in service to those in greatest need of simple justice. It is fitting that this law school bears his name as it carries forward his dream. Joe Rao was the general counsel for the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, among others, a lifelong fighter for civil rights and social justice. I'm honored to serve here as the Rao Professor of Public Interest Law. Now, as an activist, an attorney, and a public official, Dave Clark grappled with the issues that we are addressing today. How to protect low-income communities against drug abuse and violent crime without resorting to discriminatory law enforcement and disproportionate prison sentences. And if Joe Rao had lived long enough, I have no doubt that he too would have wrestled with this same dilemma. Like many of us, I have been addressing this issue, which is at the intersection of civil rights and criminal justice, for many years. It has been central to my work at three indispensable institutions: the ACLU, the NAACP, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. For all of us who promote and protect civil and human rights of every person in this country, America is a work in progress. In every area of our national life, our challenge is, and always has been, to bring our practice closer to our promise. This challenge has always been daunting in the fields of law enforcement and criminal justice, where discrimination by color, class, and culture has been woven into the fabric of these institutions themselves. The communities that we represent, low-income areas and communities of color, have complex relationships to law enforcement and the courts. These communities suffer severe levels of crime. They need an increased police presence. They need the courts to take crimes against the poor as seriously as offenses against the privileged. They need this to be a society where it is safe to take the early bus, to work the night shift, or to be a single mom or a retired worker living alone. But these communities have suffered from abuse as well as neglect. They are suspicious of the police and the courts, and understandably so, after decades of discriminatory policing, biased verdicts, and excessive sentences. As drugs became a more prevalent part of the street crime scene, including right here in our nation's capital, there was a hue and cry by some in the civil rights community for a more aggressive effort to protect our communities and especially our kids. Crack cocaine was emerging as a street phenomenon. Open-air drug markets were well known in our urban areas. Turf wars, assault weapons, and drive-by shootings were becoming all too familiar. Drug kingpins were becoming wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice. Working-class communities were in constant state of siege and crying out for the police and the courts to take notice. But from the first, there was also a concern about judicial discretion, a well-founded fear that judges who were unfamiliar with hostile or hostile to our communities would impose excessive penalties and disproportionate sentences without any consideration of the gravity of the offense or the punishments that were imposed on comparable crimes. There was also, of course, the police departments themselves, who were a source of great concern because of excessive policing that was often associated with communities right here in the nation's capital. So, for these reasons, many well-meaning leaders asked for a reduction in judicial discretion, which gave birth to mandatory minimums, which gave rise to the situation in which we find ourselves today. But, as occurs with some legislation, the drug laws began with the best of intentions, but produced unintended consequences. I remember back in 1986, when a young senator and former public defender named Joe Biden helped to launch the war on drugs out of a genuine sense of concern, that the threats to the safety of vulnerable communities and to the futures of at-risk children. Soon, reduced judicial discretion went into effect, and with it, less leniency, more standardized and harsher sentences, and more and longer prison terms. Contributing to these trends was the belief that the drug that was sweeping through the inner cities, crack cocaine, is a more potent drug than the pricier powder cocaine, whose clientele is a more affluent, influential, and white. The assumptions behind this conclusion were sociological, not pharmacological. But still, the structures were put in place, beginning with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. Now, getting tough on crime and drugs is a worthy goal, but the law's penalties and their unintended consequences went way off kilter from any reasonable goals for law enforcement or social policy. As many of us pointed out over the years, and as many experts have reminded us today, defendants convicted with just 5 grams of crack cocaine enough to yield only about 10 to 50 doses and weighing less than 2 packets of sugar, were subject to a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence. But when it came to powder cocaine, you had to be caught trying to sell 100 times as much, 500 grams, which yields between 2,500 and 5,000 doses, to be subject to the same minimum 5 years. Now that 100-to-1 disparity made no sense, was not fair, and exacerbated the social and economic injustices that have been tearing at the fabric of our society decade after decade in good times and bad. The issues were as inescapable when I wrote my first published article about this in 1994, as they were just 2 years ago when I testified before the Senate Subcommittee on Crime and Drugs. Because federal law enforcement targeted inner-city communities, African Americans and Latinos were disproportionately impacted and imprisoned. By 1993, even though non-Hispanic whites were the overwhelming majority of all cocaine users and a majority of crack cocaine users, African Americans and Latinos comprised 95.4% of those convicted of federal crack distribution offenses. In fact, African Americans, who comprised 12% of the population, represented 37% of those arrested for drug offenses of all kinds, 59% of those who were convicted, and 74% of those who were sentenced to prison. Now this contributed in turn to the explosive growth of the American prison system and the greatly disproportionate imprisonment of African Americans and Latinos and an increasing number of women. Since the abolition of apartheid in South Africa and the implosion of communism in the Soviet Union, the United States now incarcerates a larger proportion of its population than any nation on earth. Of the nation's more than 2.2 million prisoners, 41% are black and 20% are Latino. In fact, 1 out of every 3 black males born today will go to prison at some point in his life, as will 1 of 3 Hispanic males if the trend continues. Now, notice I say if present trends continue, because we can and must call a halt to this terrible trend. Many here today have already played a part in achieving this change by reforming the nation's drug sentencing laws. At the very outset, there was a recognition, not only by the civil rights community, but also by human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, that this law was a violation of human rights and the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In fact, I helped to make that point in testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when it was chaired by Senator Joe Biden. And back in 1995, on the day of the Million Man March, Congress voted down a bill to set a more reasonable set of sentencing standards. It was one of the few times that the Federal Sentencing Commission's recommendation had been overturned. The bill to overturn the provision was introduced by Congressman Bill McCullough, a Florida Republican who later served as the state's Attorney General. But interestingly enough, the bill was supported by the Clinton administration. And it was supported by the Clinton administration because Democrats were fearful of being targeted as soft on crime. And so they were prepared under those circumstances to turn their backs on the same constituency that Republicans were turning their backs on. That's just the bottom line. It has taken us 15 years to get back from that point to where we were last summer when President Obama signed the Fair Sentencing Bill into law. That bill reduced the disparity from 100 to 1 down to 18 to 4. Now, to be socked with a 5-year mandatory sentence, an offender would have to be convicted of peddling 28 grams or more. For a 10-year prison term, you have to be found guilty of pushing 280 grams or more. And importantly, there are now no more mandatory minimum sentences, just for simple possession. The first such change to a mandatory minimum since 1970. It's been a long time. It took years of painstaking advocacy, coalition building, and reaching across the aisle to achieve this victory. Now, of course, members of the Congressional Black Caucus, John Conyers, Bobby Scott, Maxine Waters, Sheila Jackson Lee, and many others were leading the charge over many years, joined by other progressive advocates of civil and human rights. But our traditional supporters brought us nowhere near a voting majority. So we brought together libertarians who objected to excessive government power, and fiscal conservatives who didn't want to spend millions of dollars to pack the prisons to the breaking point. Folks whom we ordinarily don't count on as allies. Ward Conrad, Grover Norquist, Chuck Colson, J.C. Watts, to name a few, were instrumental in building a bipartisan coalition for sentencing reform. I myself can testify to how arduous and sometimes how humorous coalition building can be. Now, as his name suggests, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, a senior Republican senator from Alabama, is a dyed-in-the-wool Southerner. He is also an incredibly reasonable man. Many in the civil rights community first became acquainted with him, as he with us, when we successfully opposed his nomination to a federal judgeship decades ago. Then he was elected to the U.S. Senate, and since became the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. So it really gives meaning to this issue of sometimes be careful for what you ask, because you just might get it. And we found out that while we couldn't always see eye to eye, he would, for most instances, hear us out. Now, as the effort for sentencing reform gathered momentum, in one of the meetings I had with him, I said to him, look, you hold the key to making reforms in this area. You know, he was a U.S. attorney. He understood what it was about to prosecute these cases. And he represents a state, Alabama, that has a more progressive drug law than many. They don't draw a distinction between crack and powder. So he had a first-hand understanding about the devastating impact of these laws in ways that few but U.S. attorneys who practice these cases often would have. So I said, look, you know, you hold the key to reform in this area. Jefferson Sessions supporting a modified crack bill is like Nixon going to China. I mean, the truth is, it's totally unexpected. So, I make that work, right? 2 years ago, when I testified in support of Justice Sonia Sotomayor's confirmation before the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Sessions was being very gracious, and he said to me, and I'm quoting, and Mr. Henderson, it's so good to work with you. Senator Leahy and I are talking during these very hearings. We're going to do that crack cocaine thing that we talked about. So I'm like stunned, and the room erupts in laughter. Now, I don't know what the national television audience thought he meant by doing that. But before I could leave the table, the video ended up on YouTube. The video was up on YouTube. And every audience at the hearing just burst into laughter. And if you go up on YouTube and take a look at it, you will hear the voice of Amy Klobuchar in the background saying, Senator, Senator, you must clarify. You must clarify. All right. To his credit, Senator Sessions took it all in good humor. And soon afterwards, he reached an agreement with Senate Democratic leader Dick Durbin that led to the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act. This agreement showed how fundamental and far-reaching progress can be achieved, not just by who has the better argument, but because the time for change has finally arrived. And guys, it's the truth with every bill we try to get. You have to have the votes of both parties. You can't do it with the votes of only one party on any issue. And so that's just the way politics in Washington is. Some on our side questioned the deal. Some said we settled for far too little. Some asked me directly why we didn't hold out for more. But the answer was plain and simple. The more that you are talking about doesn't add up to 60 votes. You get me 60 votes, I'll hold out for everything. Otherwise, sometimes you take a bill because it advances the cause. And if you can't get beyond the focus, then you may not be able to pull off even your most modest dream. Yes, the bill was half a loaf. But I'm reminded of President Johnson saying that those who sometimes refuse to settle for half a loaf have never been hungry. For those who hunger for justice, okay, for those who hunger for justice, this bill means about 2 years off somebody's sentence and time. 2 years without being in prison. Now, it doesn't mean that you're free, but it means you're not in prison. And I can think of people who, really, you look back on the terrible sentences they received. It breaks your heart. Some of you may know Kimber Smith, a young woman who was sentenced to 24 years in prison for a drug offense. First time, she was a college kid, bright, educated. Her boyfriend lured her into a difficult situation. She was eventually pardoned by Bill Clinton. She has now turned her life around completely, master's degree, successful family life, demonstrating firsthand that when you're given a second chance, some people are able to really turn it around and use it for good. And so I think about, how some who argue the need to be tough on crime, or who argue that you need to hold out for a higher principle, are not always involved in delivering on that. So, as Dr. King used to ask, where do you go from here? As a civil rights advocate, we have come full circle. We planted the seeds for this victory, and now we must reap the harvest. Now we need to work for retroactive application of the law. It won't be easy, but it is essential. Those of you who are preparing to enter the legal profession, a few in this room, should look forward to crafting the arguments that will prevail in the future, so that we can create new case law or policy that will take us where we need to go. We all must learn to present cases in ways that will make them, to use an awkward but resonant word, justiciable. And we must also work for a world where young people will no longer trade their futures away for a momentary escape from their lives. By fighting for better education, for full employment, and for health care for all, we are offering our fellow citizens from every background and every generation some good things to say yes to, as well as terrible things to say no to. Yes, we must be tough on crime and drug abuse, but we must also be tough on the causes of crime and drug abuse. As the fight for fair sentencing shows, social change seldom pursues a path that is straight and smooth. There is rarely a straight line between becoming aware of an injustice and righting a wrong. But this fight should confirm our faith that, as Dr. King famously said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it is bent toward justice. Together we have addressed a long-standing social, legal, and moral wrong. Together we have bent it toward justice. Together, armed with the skills and knowledge you are acquiring at this great institution, you can do it again and again. So I want to thank you all for inviting me here today. I want to thank you for the honor of being part of the David A. Clark School of Law family. And I really must say I'm really honored to be a part of this symposium. I think what you all are doing is so important and it's so often unheralded that it's really terrific to join you tonight. So thank you very much.
Two questions. Who wants to be the first?
I hope I've answered them all, right?
I've got one. Can we publish that in our law review?
Sure.
Oh, yeah. Okay, guys.
I'm going to count that as a question. Professor Tolman.
Is there a hook in the law that passed about retroactivity? Is there anything in there that's explicit one way or the other?
No, the law is silent.
Silent.
And the issue is now before the Sentencing Commission that will make some decisions about its recommendations to extend it. But I think there are arguments for all the time. One argument against it is that Congress knows how to make laws retroactive when they choose to do so. So the fact that the bill is silent does create, in the minds of some, presumption against retroactivity. On the other hand, there are circumstances now where cases that were brought before the change in the law in August of 2010 are now being sentenced under the old law as well. So you have lots of problems, and then you look at what's going on in some state prisons. I mean, this is obviously a federal system. But if you look at California, you now have a case pending before the court about prisoner overcrowding, Schwarzenegger versus Blau. which is an Eighth Amendment case arguing cruel and unusual punishment because they have 40,000 or more prisoners beyond capacity, stuffed in every conceivable nook and cranny in these prisons. So the idea of keeping people in prison longer just doesn't make sense. What we're trying to do, there's a group known as the Attorney General's Advisory. It consists of all 94 U.S. attorneys, 30 of them, who have formed a subcommittee on civil rights. So we meet with them quarterly. I mean, they're actually, these are U.S. attorneys who are very thoughtful and are very interested in trying to pursue a sort of path to, justice. And so we're talking about this, and, we're trying to see if we can move a little bit. I think there is a possibility that with their support and with some rational arguments of cost implications of this, we can make a persuasive case to get rid of arbitration. And I think that's really a big goal.
One more question. All right. I'll review.
If it did get applied retroactively, how do you view that working logistically? I mean, obviously it would be a huge task.
Well, it would be a case-by-case review. I mean, it's going to be a case-by-case review. There will not be a presumption necessarily that will entitle the individual to a more favorable outcome. But I think that there are some cases that clearly warrant greater leniency than current law would provide. And you've seen judges, Roger Gregory, who's a judge on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, has written himself on these issues. You have judges who have sought to assert a bit of independence, recognizing that, of course, they are in a chain of command that forces them to accept the precedents that have been handed down to them. But, there are many district court judges who have tried in dicta to express concern about what the system now requires. And I think that, look, I think that there's certain core civil and human rights issues if you're a domestic advocate who works in the field of that. So I look at, improving the quality of public education as the most important civil and human rights issue facing the country. That's number one. But this is a close second, because the impact that it has on the lives of real people, particularly young men, who have been sucked into the system at the very point in their lives when they should be establishing families, learning the craft of their job to extend them into a better life, are sucked into a system that continues, even upon release, to exercise control over the quality of life you produce. I mean, to have the governor of Florida, who just stepped back the Charlie Crist recommendations, the previous governor, for enfranchising former felons. He's just made it more difficult for them to vote. This is all about 2012. But the truth is, for somebody who is faced with those challenges, it's outrageous. I mean, it's outrageous. And you have other examples of that. I mean, I don't want to go too far. But I would simply say privatization of public services. We have governors who are privatizing public services and thus firing groundskeepers at the state house and state legislators and replacing them with prisoners. Okay, so this is slavery, 21st century style. But it works because they're serving, they're behind bars. So anyway, you get it. There's a lot of interconnections between what we do and this conversation. And I really think this is a wonderful discussion. I'm sorry that I can't join you, but thanks again for it.
What would you like to do?
I think you're doing it.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Good evening, you all. I'm Jasmine from the Drug Policy Alliance. We are the nation's leading organization trying to end the war on drugs and couch our drug policy within science, human rights, compassion, and health. Our executive director, Ethan Nagelman, likes to say we are the people that love drugs, we are the people that hate drugs, and we are the people that don't give a damn about drugs. We just know the drug war is wrong, and that is exactly what I'm here to talk to you about. I knew my colleague and coalition member Wade would talk about crack, so I will only talk about that a little bit. I'm typically referred to as the crack lady at DPA because of all the work that I've been doing for the last 4 years. And I like to say that the Fair Sentencing Act victory was bittersweet. And really, that's like how I like my chocolate. It's not really how I like my legislation. But, you know, the Fair Sentencing Act was historic. It undid one of the first mandatory minimums, the simple possession mandatory minimum for 5 grams. The first mandatory minimum to be repealed since the 70s. That is huge. As Wade said, it was the equivalent of 2 sugar packets. And that was really harmful. The problem is that the law sort of continues to keep in place this disparity that is not pharmacologically, scientifically, or legally justified. We've had almost 25 years of research on the issue, and we know now that there's no reason to keep a disparity in place because these are 2 forms of the same drug, and quite honestly, it takes powder to make crack. So to have the lower triggers associated with the end product is really quite ridiculous. So I'm here to tell you, rest assured, your Congress is only 1/5 racist now, not 100% racist, because they lowered the disparity from 100 to 1 to about 18 to 1. The new trigger is rests at 28 grams for 5 years. That's about an ounce. And the 10-year trigger is at 280 grams now. Again, it still takes 500 grams of powder and 5,000 grams for the 10-year trigger of powder. That's 5 kilos if you're listening to it like that. And, you know, one of the things, too, that's curious, and Wade sort of talked about this, is institutional racial construct that's present in our sentencing laws and our enforcement policies. And it's ironic that the years in which the crack disparity were enacted in 1986 and 1988 through the anti-drug abuse statutes, Congress was also taking up a very serious racial issue, and that was what to do with South Africa during the height of their apartheid. And in fact, passed a bill that said we will no longer engage in trade or support the South African government in any way as long as they are not promoting racial equality in their own government. And so it's ironic and curious that we wouldn't, you know, hold ourselves to that same sort of stricture. If you believe, I'm just gonna focus my comments now on two separate issues, and I'll start with the first, of course. So if you believe that the crack powder disparity was flawed, was unjust, and should have been overturned, then you must join me when I say to you, marijuana is the new crack. Let me step back. We see hyper-surveillance in African American communities. We see the brunt of these policies, these legal policies, being played out in African American communities where you have whole generations of black men, but now increasingly black women, who have been removed from these communities and who have no opportunity any longer because of the excessive sentences that they are experiencing. And they have no chances pretty much when they come back to their communities. This is sort of what Michelle Alexander has defined in her book called The New Jim Crow. This is the fact that really, post-civil rights progress, there was a platform put in place through the Nixon administration to really go after and target African Americans. And so you have Anslinger saying to Nixon, we got to figure out a way how to deal with black people without them knowing we're actually targeting them because they're black. And then in the next decade, that's about 1971, and that's when Nixon declares drugs public enemy #1, right? We're approaching, actually this June, the 40th anniversary of the drug war, 40 years of progressive policies.
You said Anslinger, but did you mean somebody else? You didn't mean Anslinger.
I believe, I could have my source wrong, and I'm always happy.
Anslinger. So he was responsible for the Harrison Act.
Right, earlier, right.
We're almost on the 100th.
Yes, I am. Well, thank you. I'm always happy to hear from my colleague Eric Sterling,
Historian.
brilliant professor, also at TW University here in town also, and another member of the Crack Disparity Coalition. Sorry, thank you, Eric. So you have this put in place, and then in the next era, in the next decade, it's really ramped up by the Reagan machine, right? And that's when you have the war on crack, and you see the media sort of just take on this mythological propaganda campaign against urban communities, but really black men. I mean, that's who they're talking about when they coin the terms urban and use that kind of language. But I'm sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought. But so what I was saying is marijuana is really the new crack. If you think that we're wasting police resources on these low-level drug arrests, like 5 grams of crack, then you have to agree that we're wasting it also on marijuana arrests. Marijuana arrests constitute more than half of all drug war arrests annually. We're talking 1.4 million arrests every year, all drug arrests. More than 850,000 of those are for marijuana, and 90% of those are for simple possession alone. I don't have to tell you, but who do you think are getting arrested? I mean, African Americans and Latinos are continuing to bear the brunt of these policies. And the problem with marijuana arrests is that you don't necessarily get a prison sentence. You don't have that excessive period of time that you spent if you were to get a crack sentence. But what you get is a life sentence. You are forever required to check the box that you were arrested. You are forever required to check the box that you were convicted of a drug law offense. And it relegates you to second-class citizenship. And that is the crux of Michelle Alexander's argument in her book, The New Jim Crow, is that this succession of policies really creates this underclass or undercaste system in which African Americans will literally, eventually, not have any of the gains that were made in the civil rights era because primarily of the voting rights restrictions, as Wade alluded to at the end of his remarks. And so you see that, below the Mason-Dixon, voting opportunities are even more restricted than they are above the Mason-Dixon. Maine and Vermont, you get to keep your voting rights. You even get to vote in prison. Senator Leahy says, he always goes to the prisons when he's doing his campaign. But then you see, below the Mason-Dixon, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, you see the same things in place, and you see the same lack of access to the voter booth. But it's not just voting. It's also in terms of social services and the access that you have to programs. So if you have a drug conviction, you can't access public benefits like TANF, food stamps, public housing, student loans. And so really, these are the pieces that continue to create that undercast system because you're never able to actually better yourself. So you can't better yourself through creating new laws because you're civically disengaged. But you're also socially disengaged from society, and so that really creates a huge barrier. I just want to tell you some statistics from east to west coast. In New York City, African Americans are 90% of the arrests. African Americans and Latinos are 90% of the arrests for marijuana in the city of New York. Last year, there were over 50,000 arrests for marijuana in the city of New York. That's more seats than are available in Yankee Stadium. That's a lot of arrests. But that's not what's troubling. What's troubling is marijuana was decriminalized in New York in the 1970s. The policy that's creating these arrests are the stop and frisk policies, the enforcement policies that the law enforcement officers, I like to call them peace officers, to remind them that that is in fact their role. They don't seem to always recognize that. But that law enforcement is really, by and large, responsible for all of these arrests because under these stop and frisk policies, you have this hyper-surveillance post-9/11 where law enforcement is hoping to catch sheriffs, to catch real crime. But the problem is, real crime hasn't gone up, and that's not the type of way to intercept real threats, real terror threats. So what happens is, law enforcement encounters someone, again, typically African American or Latino, and says, listen, do you have anything in your possession? Do you have a little marijuana in your pocket? If so, you should pull it out because I don't want to have to find it on you. And so once someone produces the joint, the small bag of marijuana that's in their backpack or their purse or what have you, law enforcement says, now it's in plain sight. And in 1970, the law said marijuana is is decriminalized, but you cannot have it in plain sight, and you cannot smoke it in public. And so once you produce the marijuana, you then are in violation of this law. And that is how the 50,000 marijuana arrests occur. The average age for these marijuana arrests is 26. 26-year-olds, and they are primarily males. I mean, as Wade attested, it's devastating communities. These are men who are embarking on their futures. They are becoming experts in their crafts, in their jobs. They are settling down and having families, but all of that is interrupted by just a marijuana arrest alone. There are other consequences, though, or let me just tell you, also in California, up and down, it's a big state, 3 times, 4 times, 7 times in some jurisdictions. African Americans and Latinos continue to be more likely to be arrested than whites in that state. And it's by and large true for states across the country. The researcher Harry Levine from CUNY in New York has done extensive research on these, and I was just with him in Chicago this weekend, where he provided, and I wish it was my own research, but he provided 27 sheets of paper that had graphs for 27 states. And the only thing he said was, turn the page, turn the page, turn the page. And what you can see from these bar graphs were that African American numbers for arrests were twice, 3 times, 4 times, 10 times the number of arrests for whites in those jurisdictions. And what we see here is de facto decriminalization. And that's what's going on. It is basically legal to smoke marijuana if you are white in the United States. Now, if you're poor and your life is not so private, then maybe you're going to be part of those white statistics that get arrested. But the reality is, by and large, it's de facto desegregation. And those aren't the only costs, though. I mentioned the racial disparities, and I mentioned the collateral consequences for these marijuana arrests. But really, marijuana prohibition is really taking a huge toll on our southwestern, or on our southern border. And it's caused over 15,000 lives below the Mexico line. And Mexican citizens are losing their lives because of the cartel violence. And the DOJ, Mr. Holder himself says 60 to 80% of the profits are coming from marijuana sales for these cartels. Yet we continue to maintain a prohibition model that harms not only ourselves, but harms Mexican citizens and is hugely, hugely ineffective. A lot of people say, well, marijuana really is a gateway theory, right? And I would say now, marijuana is not a gateway theory. If anything, it's not a gateway drug. If anything, it's a gateway to the presidency. Our last 3 presidents have had to increasingly admit and be very candid about their drug use. And so you get from, I didn't inhale, to I don't really know what happened all those years, to, well, of course I smoked it, and I inhaled it because that was the point. And so, beyond the presidency, it's also a gateway to 16 gold medals. You see Michael Phelps, who is quite athletic and quite dedicated to his sport, and can really, really shine at that. But that doesn't mean that he can't smoke marijuana also. And the reality is 100 million Americans smoke marijuana, 1 in 2 people. So if we took a poll in this room, half of us would probably raise our hands. Now, I'm not saying nobody admit to any unadjudicated bad acts. Nobody do any of that. But I mean, that's what we're talking about. I have a friend from college. I have 3 of my closest guy friends from college are all African American, and they all have graduate degrees. 2 of them have top secret clearances. One of those 2 has a marijuana charge, and he has to answer every time. And we're talking, he is engaged with society. He is civically responsible. He owns a home. But the fact remains that every time he changes his job, he has to admit to this marijuana arrest from decade. Well, okay, I'm just going to say a decade. I'm not going to admit my age. So, if nothing else, I really want everyone to think about the fact that only 7 million Americans admit to using cocaine, and only 14 million Americans admit to using methamphetamine. But if 100 million Americans are admitting to using marijuana, the numbers just don't prove that it is a gateway drug. In fact, what we hear is many people say marijuana is the last drug they use. It's the last drug as they're stepping down from intense drug addiction. Unfortunately, though, all of these marijuana arrests are getting referred through the court system into treatment, typically through probation or through drug courts.
Yeah.
So my first major point was marijuana is the new crack. And I also don't mean because of these mythologized increased levels of potency in THC. That's not what I mean. But so the second that I would state, the second point that I want to make tonight is that drug courts just are not the answer. That may be provocative because many of you law students may be thinking that drug courts provide an answer, and that as a defense attorney or a prosecutor, you want to be involved in repairing someone's life as opposed to sending them away for good. The problem, though, is that drug courts often cherry pick their clients. So they pick the clients who are most likely to succeed anyway. I argue, and the Drug Policy Alliance just released a report that's titled, "Drug Courts Are Not the Answer." You can find that on our website, drugpolicy.org. That show that these resources are really being wasted. That they should be used for people who have greater levels of criminal offense history. Typically, if you have a prior record, you can't get into a drug court. You also, ironically, typically can't get into a drug court if you've ever been to treatment before. And so if the criteria were increased for the people who are being referred to drug court, for instance, those with criminal histories, those who have even low-level violent crimes, many times folks who have low-level sex offenses can't get into them, and other types of crimes, then we really would maybe see the cost savings that are alleged. But right now what we see is that the success rate of drug courts is really similar to the success rate of people who are on probation. Again, typically because you're picking the higher functioning people. But because those people don't need the coercive hammer of the court. But those other people who have more established criminal conduct, they may, and they may benefit from it. And that's where we'll see the cost savings, because we won't be paying $25,000 a year to warehouse them. We'll be spending between $5,000 and $9,000 to treat them. Right now, we're wasting those treatment beds, those $5,000 to $9,000 treatment beds, on folks who have marijuana violations or who are in civil possession of other more harsh-seeming drugs that don't really have a problem. And so people who have chronic illnesses, because that's what we understand drug addiction to be, a chronic illness, really can't get into those slots. Another problem with drug courts is that they rely heavily on urinalysis testing. And there's a big flaw in that, because what urinalysis testing tells you is that at some point in the recent past, somebody's done something. But it doesn't tell you that they've changed their behavior. That in the less recent past, they were doing something 5 to 10 times a week, or 5 to 10 times a day. Urinalysis doesn't show you that now, though, they are only using once a day, or once a week. And that's how we measure success, changing behavior. Because if we agree that substance abuse is a disease, we have to continue to use the disease model. We don't punish diabetics who eat cake. We just don't. And so we can't continue to punish people who have a chronic health condition for taking a backslide. Many people who work in the treatment community and people who are in recovery admit that treatment and recovery is not a destination. It is a long journey. And there are many, many forward steps, and there are also backslides. And so we have to take that into account. And the challenge of drug courts is that they operate and assume a public health approach. They do. They offer treatment to people who seem to be presenting with a need. But it's within the constraints of the criminal justice system. And so I would suggest that we look to a country like Portugal, that 10 years ago was facing some of the same crises we were facing. They had huge overdose fatality rates. In the United States, overdose fatalities are actually the second leading cause of accidental fatalities, Car accidents are first, accidental discharges from firearms are third. They had a huge HIV infection and transmission rate. And what happened was, in the late 90s, a commission was put together, and they decided what the issues were at hand. And they made a host of recommendations, and the government adopted them all. They didn't pick the politically palatable ones that would be, voted, ensure their re-election in the next, cycle. They took all of them. So what they did was decriminalize the possession of drugs up to 10-day supply, and they also increased their public health opportunities. So they wildly expanded methadone maintenance treatment, which is the most successful way to step people down off of a heroin dependence. They increased their needle exchange services. They increased their treatment services. And so what they created were dissuasion boards, where if the law enforcement officer intercepted you in possession of drugs, a small amount of drugs, he would refer you to the dissuasion board in the jurisdiction that you live, not where you were caught. Because what was key to them was that the follow-up care was what was going to ensure the success. It wasn't just the referral to the dissuasion commission. And so what you see 10 years later, if I'll just look at a handy chart really quickly, is there's some minimal increase in drug use that can't be denied. But it has to be taken in a political context. Portugal used to be under a very conservative dictatorship. So the people who grew up under that dictatorship had little to no access to drugs. In the 70s, as that dictatorship was removed, you have some people who are young enough to start being curious about drugs, and you have a group of people who are just aging out and they're just not going to experiment with drugs at all. But you continue to build a younger generation that continues to use drugs. So that explains the minimal rise. But it's more important to look at the last month's drug use, which has been flat. So the same number of people used drugs last month as used drugs in 2001, 99, 2000, 2001. And drug use has gone down from 18% for 16-year-olds to 14%. And so you cannot deny that it has had some impact in the younger generation using drugs. And one of the other things that they put in place was a better media campaign. And it was much more targeted, it was much smarter, and it was not just say no or dare to keep your kids off of drugs. Because we know those approaches have literally failed in the United States. And so, in addition to the decrease in drug use and the flat drug use rates for adults, they reduced transmission of HIV and then subsequent, AIDS-related deaths. They reduced their overdose fatalities from somewhere in close to 1,000 to 18. I mean, just hugely impactful results. And so I would say that you should really look to a model of a public health provision system that is just that. It's couched in their Ministry of Health. It has nothing to do with their Ministry of Justice. Now, drug selling, drug trafficking, drug cultivation, drug manufacturing is still a crime. But they've had these successful results because they are doing something different with both recreational users and people who present with real substance abuse problems. So I'll leave you with those two statements, and I'm happy to take questions, but I do have to apologize. I have to go out of town, so I'll too leave in right after the questions. Sure, I'll take the questions now. I guess that means I get an A.
Well, let me ask you. I've had some people raise the question about whether in Portugal we can rely on that sample because their use may be different than our use, and if you were to decriminalize marijuana, you would have a big bump in teenagers and others using marijuana. Matter of fact, I think a study came out in Colorado indicated that medical marijuana was being bootlegged and that they had seen in the last year an increase in marijuana use by juveniles and by youngsters or teenagers. And I think Columbia University has suggested that potential as well in California.
Well, it's interesting because one of the big concerns in Portugal was that the people of Portugal and other Europeans and international travelers would flock to Lisbon. And Lisbon would then be this drug tourist capital, destination spot, and that just simply hasn't met it. It just hasn't shown up. Okay. And similarly, in the countries in which we have that marijuana particularly is decriminalized, what you see is a slight bump of interest with the removal of the taboo, but that really just flatlines, it flattens out, and that you don't see this. And one of the things that we know from independent studies of the ONDCP, the Office of National Drug Control's youth media campaign, is that it has been counterproductive in that it has not met its goals, it has not kept youth from using drugs. And some studies have shown that exposure to these ads has actually increased the use rates of youth and their interest in drugs. And so I would say that it's not the prevalence of medical marijuana, because you don't see that in other nations, and you certainly don't see that in the other 15 states plus the colony of the District of Columbia that have marijuana statutes. But that it's in large part because of the way we run our prohibition model.
What about monitoring the future? Mm-hmm. So there's these annual surveys called Monitoring the Future that are done at school-age kids in 6th, 8th, and 12th grade. And in the last 5 years, you haven't seen any change in when kids report the age they first start using alcohol, cigarettes, or marijuana. Even in states where they, have easier access, like California or potentially Colorado. So it's doubtful that, this is the great fear that you'll reduce the initiation rate. And, that's been what people have talked about for decades, why we can't change our marijuana laws. And so I think you could look more towards that as proof that.
And I think we see really good interventions and prevention campaigns being run now by alcohol and tobacco industry. They are much more effective, and you see that youth rates are down, and that's partially because access is restricted on an age basis as well. And so coupling the preventative messaging with the restriction model is much more effective than just a prohibition model in and of itself. And since you brought up Colorado, I'll just say, in Denver, ironically, there has been an increase in the number of drug arrests that they have been making since the inception of their drug court. And what this shows is that there really is a net widening effect too. So the more police and prosecutors and judges think that there's an option available for people to help them with, they will try to throw as many people at it as possible. And again, you're getting the wrong people using those services and detracting from the possibility of really intervening in other people's lives. So that's it.
Are there any countries that have followed the Portugal steps?
Well, there are other countries, and there are a lot of countries in Europe who have decriminalized drugs, but you have the Netherlands model, you have Australia, and then you have also Mexico, which had to declare or decriminalize drugs given the rise in violence, cartel violence, and in police corruption, quite honestly. So there are some other countries to look to as well.
I gave a talk on...
I can hardly hear you.
I gave a talk on Portugal earlier in the day. It seems that the other countries in Europe, one interesting thing that is happening is that the ones that are following their steps are doing it in a de facto sense rather than a de jure sense, and explicitly eliminating their policies, which means on the law enforcement level, you get into the same problems of selective enforcement in terms of which populations, and although, the quote-unquote minority populations aren't the same in the European context as the United States, you get the same problems of who is the police going to cite, who are they going to treat differently, and who are they not going to, and I think that's an important part about just the way that you approach decriminalization rather than just saying decriminalize drugs generally.
I think that's a really good point. One of the things that I didn't want to sort of harp on, but I would bring up now, is the fact that people of color and poor people have a very difficult time getting into and succeeding in drug courts. And many times that's because, we know what happens to people of color at every phase of the criminal justice system. It is much harsher for them, and they have much worse outcomes. And so that sort of selection process is also happening. But in terms of poverty, the problems are really this. Many times, drug courts require you to have a phone line in your home so that you can, be on an ankle monitor, or you can be on some sort of home monitoring system. And I'll be very honest, I have a decent job, and I don't even have a phone line. We have, my partner and I, we have 2 cell phones. He uses his, and I use mine, so we don't have a home line. So this is really an arbitrary measure, but for people who are poor, it's very, very critical. And you're right, many countries are following a sort of de facto decriminalization, and in fact, that was how Portugal operated up until the 2000 when the law was passed. There was widespread de facto decriminalization, and that didn't actually get them anywhere. But one of the benefits of the Portugal decriminalization models in terms of at least drug availability is that while individual seizures have not gone up, the quantities of seizures have really gone up. And that's because they're able to do better policing. They're really able to go after the high-hanging fruit, not the low-hanging fruit, so to speak.
One additional comment. There was a study in Canada that was reported last summer that indicated that actually people smoking marijuana, it wasn't as harmful as smoking tobacco, and only about 8 or 9% of people had a genetic some type of disability, which indicated that they may lose impulse control or excessive, much like alcohol, drink to the excess or so forth, but it may be given that little category of 8 or 9% that uses excessively, but for people that didn't use excessive, really recreational, indeed tobacco was even more harmful. I just thought I'd throw that in just for background.
That's a good comparison. I think that's my time. Thank you so much for letting me share the evening with you. I think this has been a really great symposium. I couldn't come, but I was very intrigued by the full agenda, so I hope you learned a lot today.
Actually, I'm going to stand up. I'm not going to use the mic. I'm a trial lawyer, so I'm used to yelling everything.
Don't tell me you're going to pace back and forth, though, for my camera.
Pace back and
oh,
forth.
man.
Yeah. I'm going to start out telling you guys why I'm here. And in Texas, people used to say that the drug war is over and the drugs won. I'm not sure that's a fair way to put it, but if that's true, I was on the losing side, as a private, more or less. I was a federal prosecutor in Detroit from 1995 to 2000. A lot of my cases were small-time crack cases. That's who I prosecuted in many of those cases, were people that had a little bit over 5 grams. And I did think I was doing the right thing in those cases. I believed in the sentencing guidelines. I went to law school, interested in criminal law, and when I was there, I had a professor named Dan Freed. Professor Freed was an opponent of the guidelines. And in class, week after week after week, we would battle, and I would support the guidelines because I thought they provided uniformity across the board and that there was fairness in that. And that's one reason I became a prosecutor, was that I thought that my hometown of Detroit, what it needed was better law enforcement, in part. Now, I still think that. I'm not sure that we did it. But I was very committed to the uniform application of the law that was on the books. And when I was a prosecutor, most of the other people felt the same way that I did. One day in 1997, I had a sentencing in front of a judge named Anna Diggs Taylor, who was the chief judge at that time in the Eastern District of Michigan. Opposing counsel was a federal defender named Andrew Dancino, and it was a very simple case. This guy had gone to trial. He had been found in a house, an abandoned house. He had a little bit over 5 grams of crack, and there was a gun under the couch cushion. We called this a 5 and 5. Here's a mandatory 5-year sentence for the crack, a mandatory 5-year sentence on top of that for the gun. He was 18 or 19 years old. His name was Bull Shepherd. And we'd had the trial. The sentencing came along 3 months later, and I went to the sentencing. I didn't have to prepare anything. It's a mandatory sentence. So I showed up in front of Judge Taylor, and she said, "Mr. Osler, what are you asking for?" And I said, "It's a 5 and 5, Your Honor. It's a mandatory 10-year case." And she turned to my opposing counsel, Andrew Densimo, and she said, "Are you going to give your usual futile argument?" And he said, "Yes, I am." For the next 20 minutes, he told the truth. And he talked about what this type of prosecution did in the community, about how it wasn't solving the problem of use or of trafficking. He talked about what it was doing in terms of the people it was incarcerating. He talked about what it was going to do to that kid, Bull Shepherd. And it was a pretty incredible speech. And when he was done with his futile speech, Judge Taylor turned back to me and said, "Mr. Osler, do you have any response?" And I said, "Your Honor, it's 5 and 5. It's a mandatory 10-year case." And I went back to my office and somebody said, "Oh, what'd you have?" And I said, "I had a gun and drug case, gun and crack case." And they said, "Oh, did you have Densimo on the other side?" And they said, "Yeah." And they said, "Did he give his futile speech?" And we laughed a little bit about that. But I thought about it over time. And he was right. And one of the points that he made was so good that I still carry with me. One of the reasons, they mentioned the Spears case. That case I did with one student. I wrote the brief sitting at my kitchen table in Waco, Texas. And the reason why was Andrew Densimo. You know, when that case came down, judges called that I'd known. They were happy because they got their discretion back. And there was a judge named Art Tarnow from Detroit who called me up and said, "Congratulations on winning that case." And I told him about Andrew Densimo because he knew the characters involved. And he said, "Did you ever tell Andrew that?" And I realized I hadn't. I hadn't talked to Andrew Densimo in 10 years. So I called him up and told him about his futile speech. But one of the things he said that meant so much was he said, it didn't solve the problem. And that's something I've been thinking about ever since. This is true. Those laws didn't solve the problem. They didn't bring down drug use. They didn't curtail the trafficking. They didn't do anything but incarcerate a lot of people. Now, if that's the goal, it was successful. If the goal was almost anything else you can conceive of, it wasn't. So, where did we go wrong? A while ago, I thought maybe the problem was this, that drug trafficking is a business, and we lose sight of that sometimes. That it's a business. It's a big international business. In fact, it's a bigger international business than auto sales and production. That's pretty big. Our tactic at addressing that business was to remove the low-wage labor, to take the middle-level managers, the mules, the street-level dealers, and sweep them up. And it worked about as well as shutting down Walmart by arresting the greeters. The problem with our tactic of we're going to shut this business down by taking away the low-wage labor is that we did this in an environment with a wealth of low-wage labor, where there was always people willing to step up and fill those spots. No wonder it didn't work. And those businesses adjusted to that business reality of needing to constantly replace people. You know, there was a heroin gang in Detroit called Young Boys Incorporated because they were one of the ones that pioneered the use of juveniles for those jobs because they got out of jail fast and they were easily replaceable. And how evil is that? But our tactic drove them to that. They adjusted, like any business does, to the reality of the market that we created through government action. So if that doesn't work, and I think most of us will agree, that doesn't work, it hasn't worked, we've proved it by now, what would work? And I've been asking people that, because I don't know. I'm not a businessman, I never owned a business. But one good thing about being in Texas is people love to talk about business. And last summer, I got an invitation, kind of out of the blue, from the Dallas Republican Club. And the Dallas Republican Club said, why don't you come up and talk about drug policy? And I said, sure. Because, you know, the thing about the Dallas Republican Club is they might not agree with me on a lot of things, but maybe we do agree about some things, and I can't pretend that what they think isn't important. It may not be important to some people, but what they think is pretty important, what's happening down there right now. I mean, as Wade Henderson said, it has to be a voice, or two voices, or four voices that come together to make something actually change. So I went up to the Dallas Republican Club and talked a little bit about what I've said here, and then I said, I don't have the answer because I don't have the background. I want you to tell me something. How many of you own or manage a business? And the majority of people said that at some point in their lives they had owned or managed a business. And I said, if I wanted to shut down your business, what would I do? And we had a great discussion. And you know what every single member of that audience said, and every single member of an audience since then has said? Two things. Cash flow and credit. That if you can restrict cash flow and credit to a business, it is going to fail. We need to make narcotics traffickers fail as a business, and then we'll solve the problem. And the way to do that is not to take the drugs coming in, is not to arrest the low-wage labor, is to take the money going back. And the reason that that would work is because it's a business. If their margin is 20%, 30%, we don't have to take all the money. We have to take 21%, and then the business fails. And then that part of the problem is gone. Now, why do this? Why would it be worth the effort? I think it would be worth the effort because this country is committed to doing something about drug trafficking. What the other people have said, even people who believe in decriminalization, is not about decriminalizing trafficking. If we're going to have legal marijuana, we're not going to have it from a cartel in Mexico, I hope. And so we still have to deal with that. And so how do we deal with it? The way we can deal with it is by restricting the cash flow going back. Now, the reason that's a weak point for that business is because they don't have access to other markets. They don't have access to selling stock to raise money. They can't go and get a bank loan in a legitimate way. And so they're highly dependent on that cash flow. If we can grab it, it'll have a big effect. Now, can we do that? Can we grab the money? Is it really that easy? It's not easy, but it's not any harder than trying to grab the drugs that are coming in. And the other thing is that we have a great opportunity because since 9/11, our nation has very much focused on techniques to identify trails of money. We're much better at it than we used to be. And we need to leverage that in this way. This morning, front page, the Washington Post. U.S. found a surprise as it sought to hinder Libya about how in the few days since that action began, they've identified the accounts. They found $27 billion. That fast. And you know what? Muammar Gaddafi
in one bank.
In one bank. Muammar Gaddafi is pretty good at hiding money. And we found it. We can do that. We have the potential to do that. The other thing is that we can use the techniques we already have. A lot of money is smuggled back to Mexico in cash because they want to avoid the banking system and checks and everything else. And if we want to follow that money and grab it and forfeit it, we just do the same kind of investigations we do right now to sweep up the labor. You start at the bottom, you work your way up, and instead of following the people, you follow that cash. And as it's driving towards Mexico, you stop that truck and you take the money and we keep it. And the business fails. And you don't have 1 million people in prison. That would work if we care about solving the problem. And I sincerely think people do care about solving the problem as we go forward. Now, there's a lot of challenges to doing this, certainly. But it answers a lot of questions, too. For example, one thing, if we're trying to talk to conservative values, one of the things that is important is the idea of federalism. One of the things that's offensive to conservatives about what we've done is that we have sent street agents from the federal government to do 5-gram cases all over the country. That's not a federal concern. What should be a federal concern is taking the money off, going back. There are there's one other thing that I want to say about the change that we need to do, and that is if you wanted to implement this, first of all, you just change the investigative priorities. You say, okay, you people that are sweeping up people, sweep up money. Let's use those techniques. And that can be done without a legislative change. But if you were going to change legislation, the thing to change is the way that our legislation, for some reason, equates the weight of narcotics that you are carrying with culpability. We should have learned from Al Capone that that doesn't work. Al Capone wasn't driving a beer truck.
Right.
And, you know, the people who are making the money off this aren't carrying the narcotics. Instead of scaling sentences to how much weight you're carrying, it should be scaled to how much money you're making. There's a reason that almost all narcotics defendants have public defenders. They're not rich. And we're not bringing in the people who are rich. We're getting other people. If we had an incentive to law enforcement to get to the most culpable people by following the money, that would make a lot more sense. And we could get the people with those specialized skills as we're grabbing that money, as we're making the business fail. I want to talk to people about this. I mean, I'll tell you something. I wrote a totally different article for this symposium. And in fact, what they talked about trailing edge guidelines, that article's done. It's pretty good. But 2 weeks ago, I was thinking about this. And I thought, I have to write about this. This is the time to do this. And so this is the first time I'm talking about this. But drug policy generally, will this have political appeal? I want to tell you why I think it will. Last year in November, I was asked to go speak at Harvard Law School on narcotics policy. And
what's the name of the law school?
Yeah, something. Yeah. And it was interesting, and I enjoyed it a lot, and I had a good audience and great questions. Now they asked me to come back in April, and I said I'll come back in April if the event is co-sponsored by the NAACP and the Federalist Society. I had a reason for doing that. And it worked. We had a panel, and then we had a debate where anybody, students, faculty, me, could go and enter the debate. And what was fascinating was that the most fervent arguments against our current drug policy came from the Federalists. If we give them the chance to work with us, if we look to their values, the good ones, and incorporate them into the way we talk about these things, if we become conservative in the sense of believing in federalism as it applies to this, something good can happen. Because there are people of good faith on all sides of this. And I do think that they want to solve the problem the same way that we do. So I want to talk about this. I'm glad I get to talk about this tonight because I'm someone that believes in futile speeches. You never know who's listening or what they're going to do with it. And I hope those of you that are students here, that you think about that someday when you're at a sentencing or something, that maybe the judge has her hands tied, but maybe I'll be there, and someday I'll be sitting at my kitchen table in Waco, Texas, writing a brief, and Justice Scalia will write the opinion that says you're right. It happened. Thank you.
All right, so I'm Faye Taxman, and I'm a researcher. I do a lot of studies, and what I want to talk about tonight is actually the creeping mission that we've attached to the war on drugs. And that creeping mission is encompassed under this concept of public safety. So I challenge anyone here to really come up with a definition of what public safety is and what it means and how it came into our public formula in terms of how we think about the role of what we expect out of the war on drugs, what the role is we expect out of the judiciary as part of the public safety mission, what the role is we expect out of correctional agencies. So can anyone here kind of think back of when they started hearing this term public safety?
When that phrase was used to
Right, when that
describe
phrase-
a police function?
Right.
It seems to me weren't sort of weren't police departments being renamed sort of departments of public safety in the 70s?
So it started in the 70s, pretty much when we were the war on drugs started to creep into our place. It went from police to corrections in the late 80s, mainly when corrections agencies realized, particularly probation and parole, that if they were public safety, they could get law enforcement retirement benefits. Right? Because up until that time, probation and parole officers and most correctional officers were actually covered under general government retirement benefits, which means that you have to work 30 years or so in your job. But if you're in a law enforcement benefit package, you generally only have to work 20 years and then you can retire. And so there was a big movement in the late 80s, early 90s for probation and parole and correctional agencies to move into and identify with law enforcement. And part of that came into being as a way of sort of, public employees thinking about how they could get a better benefit structure. But it had a collateral impact because once you have probation and parole officers who identify themselves as law enforcement officers, they then have to meet those training requirements. So now you have probation and parole officers who carry guns. You have probation and parole officers who identify themselves as being law enforcement and the role that they assume in terms of how they are managing and monitoring people involved in under their correctional control is from a law enforcement perspective. And so what we saw at the same period of time as the benefit package changed for those public employees is we also saw the discussion about increasing the number of conditions on probation and parole supervision. And the reason I'm interested in probation and parole supervision instead of most people who are interested in incarceration is because, first of all, there's 5 million people on probation and parole in this country. If you're between the ages of 18 and 65, more likely 1 out of 23 people will be involved under some sort of probation and parole supervision in this country. That's a really negative social indicator. And if you are in the probation and parole system, this is why what Jasmine was talking about marijuana is such troubling, is because it's an endless system. Revocation rates for failure on probation and parole account for 40% of the intakes to prisons in this country. So the churning that occurs begins with that one point, which is probation. Giving someone a probation sentence is like giving someone a sentence to their criminal justice career, because it's an evolving problem that we've created by thinking about probation and parole as being something that we want to control people. So our social indicators are horrendous, and I was very heartened to hear the discussion, and I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you most of today about thinking about marijuana and where we are with marijuana, about thinking about the consequences of this current practice. And I was tickled pink the other day when I got an email that said, someone was actually challenging the drug court model. And I was only tickled pink because I really think that we only think about our solutions within the framework of what the criminal justice system can do. And we don't think about our societal responsibilities. So I was tickled pink about that. I'm highly troubled by the latest trend in my field, criminology, which is police researchers talking about, there's been 4 talks that I can point to in the last 4 months, about transferring the resources from mass incarceration to police. And so criminologists, Larry Sherman, who's a famous criminologist, David Weisberg, Dan Nagin, are all talking about the fact that we should reduce incarceration and add to police. And I wish they were here to have listened to Wade in terms of what is the role of the police as the entree to the criminal justice system. Because criminologists don't think outside the box of what the criminal justice system can do. They don't think about other options that exist in society that could actually deal with some of the problems. So what have we done with the war on drugs? Well, what we have done is that basically we have 1 out of 23 18 to 65-year-olds who are involved in the criminal justice system. We have a reach that is very deep. Recent statistics are that 1 out of 5 people has some sort of arrest history in this country, which means that depending upon what state, it could affect their livelihood and their ability to participate in the civic discourse. We have a reach that's so deep that 1 out of 28 children in this country has a parent involved in the criminal justice system. And so if we only think about the criminal justice system as a solution, then we are really going to limit our options about what we can do as a society. And so I really like the thinking about the business model and thinking outside the box about what are some of our other options. Because it is true, we need to deal with drug trafficking as a business. But it is also true that we need to deal with the fact that we have now created a disenfranchised population of people who, 1, can't participate in society, but 2, they actually are extremely unhealthy. So the national statistics on people who are involved in the criminal justice system mirror all the social indicators of public health problems that exist in this country. So you find that 1 out of 2 people in the criminal justice system has a sexually transferred disease. You find that mental health disorders occur for 1 out of 2 people. You find that tuberculosis is more common in the criminal justice system than any place else, 1 out of 3 people. And that hepatitis C, which affects liver functioning and has long-term effects on health of an individual, 1 out of 4. And the HIV virus, of course, is 1 out of 45. But what's even more troubling is that for kids, and there was a recent study that was conducted in Tampa, Florida, for kids who are arrested and picked up, either for a status offense or a delinquent offense, that 1 out of 3 young men under 18 years old had an STD, and 1 out of 2 girls between the ages of 13 and 17 had an STD. So we have within our criminal justice system people who are unhealthy, and I would contend that part of our troubling is that once people are involved in the criminal justice system, their health care declines, their mental health status declines, and so that contributes further to the churning that actually occurs. So we have offenders that have copious unmet needs, and the criminal justice system does not necessarily provide for that. Only when people are incarcerated in jail and prisons do they get access to medical care. When people are in the community, those 5 million on probation, they do not. We also have a criminal justice system that does not know how to deliver good quality substance abuse treatment services. We have tremendous gaps in services. We offer low quality, inconsequential, ineffective, mind-boggling remedies for people who have substance abuse disorders that we would not offer under any other scenario. And then we want to know why people fail. So we did a survey, Matt Perdoni, Matt's So here, Matt was working with me a couple of years ago. He helped on this big national survey of criminal justice agencies across the country to look at what kind of treatment services and healthcare services are provided. And I've been doing this work for 30 years. I'm not afraid to admit my age, like some people. Tell Jasmine. But, and I have to say that I was more than, I was actually astounded by some of the numbers. So some of the numbers that we found in the survey is that on any given day, less than 10% of the population can access some sort of substance abuse services. So here's a system where we have a concentration of people with substance use disorders, and we can't even deliver the services. Even more than that, when we deliver services, we deliver to people who have chronic disorders, alcohol and drug education. That's like me, who's an asthmatic, going to my doctor, and he basically is giving me a lecture on what is asthma. I mean, it doesn't do anything. But yet then we contribute to people's failures because people don't get better, and we think of them as not being appropriate for any type of care. In our survey, we looked at the implementation. Science has come up with effective practices. We looked at the implementation of effective practices, and we basically learned that less than, that the average correctional agency only implemented 3 to 5 of the 15 eligible effective practices. And even when they were doing that, they were low quality implementation. So that it begs the question of whether we think that we can transform a criminal justice system to actually deal with the significant issues, particularly mental health, substance abuse, and medical issues that people present to come into the criminal justice system. And so as we begin to think about solutions, we're always thinking about solutions within the criminal justice system. We're thinking about adding on more drug courts. Okay, we've been doing drug courts for 20 years. Less than 3% of the offender population with a substance use disorder can access a drug court in this country.
Right.
After 20 years. What makes us think that we can expand to scale? Determining scale means serve the population that needs it. We can't within the criminal justice system because the criminal justice system actors in and of themselves have a public safety mindset that has creeped into functioning. I've done most of my work in the last 5 years about trying to bring in clinical techniques for probation officers and parole officers and correctional officers to really learn to deal with people with respect and dignity. And, it works, but it's a long haul because the organization sucks the oxygen out of these folks who want to do this. It's like I was in one state and we were doing a training and the parole officer said, this all makes sense. But I get these emails from my boss, and the emails say, how many people did you revoke last week? Because that's what we count as an agency. So here I am talking about doing motivational interviewing, and they're interested, think it might be useful, but they got to report on revocations. And so that mission, that public safety mission is there. So I really think that we have to look at this opportunity now, particularly with healthcare reform and the potential, and I know some people will not like this, but the potential for basically relying upon that as the vehicle to really provide care. You, buddy, lawyers, you should be fighting for making sure that this healthcare reform deals with those disadvantaged people. You should be fighting for getting rid of these specialty care, like block grant dollars that fund our substance abuse services in this country. You don't know, one of the things that Reagan did when he closed down all the public health treatment clinics that were in existence in this country and cut back the funding, he started to give states block grant dollars for their drug treatment services. Give them 25% less than the actual value of the services. But he gave them block grant dollars, so all states now get this hunk of money that they can then distribute. Well, one, it's never enough, and two, it creates specialty care so that substance abuse services aren't embedded in primary care services, emergency clinics that people go to. We create barriers to helping people at places where they really need to get help. And so we should be looking at this period of time for reform in our health care, in trying to provide people on the streets with better access to care. And yet I know very well that disadvantaged people in our society do not get access to good quality care now, and that the clinics that are operating are overburdened, but we have a golden opportunity now to think differently and to put pressure on the criminal justice system to expand the ability to give people health care. It's very sad for me as a criminologist to say, and for someone who spent the last 2 decades trying to reform different aspects of the criminal justice system, that I really don't think it's worth the effort of trying to reform people who have guns on their hips, to think that they are the ones that are going to solve these social problems, because they can't get past the gun on the hip. And believe me, I have trained many probation officers that sit there with their guns and they listen to it and they're trying to do the role plays, but the gun is still there. And it's just an image that, when you think about it, it's not where people are going to get help and come to try and address their problems. So I really think that the consequences we have of failing to deal with these substance use, mental health problems that have come into the system, the children whose parents are consistently involved in the criminal justice system, we need to deal with it through non-criminal justice avenues. And we need to be thinking strongly and putting pressure on the criminal justice system to not neck wipe. All these things that Jasmine was talking about, marijuana laws, are mission creep issues. I always tell, in my sentencing class, I always tell the students, the reason the criminal justice system and law enforcement likes the marijuana laws is because it's an easy arrest. They don't have to do much work for that arrest. When you consider, trying to make a case for a burglary or make a case for, some sort of robbery, it's a very different experience. And so it's easy for police officers. And that's one of our problems is that, they don't need the type of evidence to be able to make those cases. So I encourage you to really think about a public health mission as being the focus of what we should be pushing forward with. I also encourage you to hear this notion that we should take money out of corrections and give it to police, that we should not move in that direction, because this will just recycle our problems again. So I want to leave you basically with 2 thoughts. One is that we really need to begin to think about how to engage people who have been involved in the criminal justice system in a respectful way, that person can find a life for themselves. I had the most unfortunate incident. I'm looking for someone, a postdoc, someone who finishes their PhD and then works with me on studies to begin their academic career. I had a wonderful applicant, just wonderful, and he was a delightful young man. Not young, but and then he told me that he had been arrested when he was 20. He's now 40. He spent 7 years in prison for a drug crime. And so he has a criminal record. And I had to go through my agreements with states that I'm doing data to see whether or not I could allow someone with a criminal record to participate in research projects. And unfortunately, it's the hardest thing I had to do. I had to tell him I could not hire him on this particular grant, even though he got out of prison, he got a bachelor's degree, he got a master's degree, he got a PhD, he has a grant right now from the American Statistical Association, something I couldn't do because I don't have that statistical skills. And it was, it was a slap in my face in many ways, because I'm sitting here thinking, why did we put this barrier on this person who's really done the redemption thing? he's done everything we've asked him to do. And yet there are these limits that exist. So being the troublemaker I am, I actually am going to find a way to hire him. That's my commitment. But I can't hire him through this one vehicle. I'm working with a colleague of mine. But I encourage you to really think past the criminal justice system and encourage the people you know that we have to begin to not criminalize everything and think about the criminal justice umbrella as a way of dealing with our problems. And I really hope and encourage many of you take on this notion that it's the public health system that we need to be putting our money into right now, because that's where we can get people to take better care of themselves. So I thank you for this opportunity to talk, and I hope I can go over.
One of the disadvantages of being last in a way is being to get smaller and smaller, but I'm going to try to be very brief and get to the heart nub of the problem of war on drugs. The very first point I want to make, we cannot have a tunnel vision. We cannot look at the issue of war on drugs in isolation as just a war on drugs. Let me bring to you a perspective that no one has talked about, at least tonight, and very seldom gets mentioned in the press. Another devastating consequence of the war on drugs in minority communities. For 2 years, I sat on first-degree murder and rape calendar, and 2/3 of my cases would have been death penalty cases if they had death penalty in the local judicial system. And frequently, I had young men who were on the scene in a drive-by shooting or a gang rape. And the public defender, when cross-examining the young man who had flipped-footed and was testifying for the government so that he would not be prosecuted for being an aider and abettor or being a part of a conspiracy, making a deal for some other charge he had, would say, when I was in the 4th grade, I was a good AP student. But then as I got to the 5th grade, I was jumped and beaten every day, and they say, if you want not to have your nose bloody, not to be robbed, you need to join the gang. Be part of us, part of the crew. And then he said, the lieutenant who was pushing the drugs gave me a cigarette to smoke, and I said, I don't want to smoke that stuff. He said, well, you smoke it and it's got cocaine in it, because if the police snatch you, we want to make sure there's cocaine in your system. It's tragic in this country, the story has never been told. How many young black men get coerced into drug use and joining crews or gangs? I've even had them leave the country, flee to Mexico in order to try to escape the gangs and not be killed when they start drive-by shootings. So another consequence of the war on drugs is that some of our brightest, most intellectually capable young black boys get forced into criminal activity at 10, 11, and 12 years of age. Just thought I'd bring it to your attention because I don't think the American public appreciate the war on poverty that we must also fight, in addition to the war on drugs. And the lack of jobs and opportunities in minority communities in urban cities. I just tell you that just to give you a little different insight. Another area that we have to perpetrate a quote war is the war on our education system. Joe Tillman and I had a conversation before this started about how schools push kids out of school, truancy and disciplinary problems, rather than build their self-esteem and encourage them with reference to wanting to be in school and excelling and achieving. And so we need not only to be stressing on the leaving no child behind, reading literacy and math literacy, we need also to deal with the issues of making a child feel belonged in the school and wanted in the school, and that the school is promoting intellectual achievement and accomplishment by those students. And indeed, the National African American Drug Policy Coalition has developed as its #2 mission, developing a drug education and prevention program that goes far beyond the concept of just saying no to drugs. We send in black professionals, social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, lawyers as guest lecturers, starting in the 3rd grade, to talk to youngsters about the health aspects of using drugs and alcohol. Just like you're talking about nutrition and drinking milk to build the calcium you need in your body. And how using drugs impairs the functioning of the body, the neurological system. And we do this on a year-round basis. And from the 3rd grade all the way through high school, whenever the schools invite us in, so that it's not a scared straight idea, but it's like educating youngsters and educating the American public about tobacco. So hopefully we will discourage our youngsters from using drugs, becoming involved in trafficking in drugs, by telling them about the medical, public health consequences of drug usage starting at the 3rd grade level. And in addition, we encourage them to engage in educational excellence, to excel, to develop that muscle between the ears. And we promise them, and we are delivering, that when they get to the 8th grade, they tell us, I want to be a doctor. We will give them a doctor as a counseling mentor, rather than their drug gang or crew to force them into a criminal lifestyle. And we will try to disband the gangs and crews in our inner cities and remove these kids, these youngsters from that pressure. And when they get to be juniors and seniors in high school, we will provide internships that are apprenticeships in the fields they want to go in. So that if a youngster wants to be an architect, he work in an architect's office, or an engineer in an engineer's office. So we have to also have a war on our education system, and how our teachers and our administrators in our schools treat minority youth in our schools, if we're going to combat this war on drugs as well, and not force our kids, our youngsters, into a criminal justice mode or use of drug courts. With reference to drug courts, while the National African American Drug Policy Coalition has encouraged the use of drug courts, we have had a concern also from the very beginning about the cherry picking and picking only those people who would, quote, succeed, and that they only reach about 8 or 10% of the people that really need it. Indeed, in connection with the healthcare reform, we supported the concept of creating in our community health clinics a division dealing with screening and initial referrals for emotional or mental disturbances for people who come in just off the street without a criminal charge or a family court neglecting abuse or welfare case hanging over their heads. We support the whole idea that a person should be able to get treatment for mental health under the Wellstone approach of parity to the same extent that he or she gets treatment for physical illness. And the sooner the better, rather than allow mental illness or the drug abuse issue to become very serious. And we are lecturing and working with social action committees in churches across the country to try to remove the distrust that African Americans have of the medical system and being subject to psychiatric or psychological screening and oversight to protect them. Those Those are some of the things we're doing, but in addition, we got to also have a war on the need of creating jobs, legitimate jobs, and promoting within minority communities the courage to be small business entrepreneurs, not necessarily just depending on being employers. To take a leaf out of Booker T. Washington's philosophy of self-determination, of going into small business and being registered. As a matter of fact, it probably will surprise you that the census for 2010 showed that more blacks went into small business, higher percentage of the population than any other component of the American population. We need to do that more, and some of these entrepreneurs in drug trafficking, we have to put that counter to legitimate business. These are some of the solutions that we begin to think for today. And we need also to, in connection with jobs, prepare our young 18 and 19-year-old boys emerging in Minneapolis with on-the-job training in community colleges and technology training so they can qualify for the jobs of the 21st century. Those are some of the answers, and indeed, Dr. Parker, who's here with me, has been working with me for the last 7 years, as the National African American Drug Policy Coalition, has not only exercised an approach of talking about theory and philosophy, but thinking about programs and approaches we can implement to begin to change and begin to show a way out of the current war on drugs. I thank you. Any questions? I know the hour's late, and it's about 8:30, and it's a little bit ahead of time. So do we have our...
Yeah. Earlier, Jasmine had mentioned Michelle Alexander's book, and one of the things you talked about in the book, and since we have a prosecutor here, I'd like to get your thoughts on it. In terms of prosecutorial discretion, that obviously when you have the public safety, they make the arrest, but often there's selection that's done in terms of who gets charged, who goes into which one of the silos, and it's done in a black box. That it's beyond questioning. A, do you think that there's any way that reforming that black box or exposing that decision-making process can help get to some of the reasons or to help change some of the decisions that are made to incarcerate the low and to give leniency to those who have more resources? Does that exposure help change the dynamic at all?
And let me just tack on this one additional comment to that question. I have been traveling around the country frequently, had prosecutors say, well, we got a 21-year-old guy before us, he got caught with drugs, quantity enough for intent to distribute, but he hasn't been employed the last 6 or 7 years, so we don't agree to him going to drug court, even though it's his first arrest. They assume that because he's been unemployed, doesn't have steady employment, middle-class lifestyle, that they just catch him. So they make those assumptions or conjectures that we're going to prosecute him to the hill. Can you comment on that as part of his question?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I remember when I first got the job, my first sentencing was in front of a judge named Abraham Cohn. Judge Cohn was put into his position by Jimmy Carter, been around for a while. And I showed up and said, I'm ready to go. And he said, well, what do you want? I thought that was an odd way to put it. And he said, because you've got all the power here. And over the years that I was a prosecutor, I learned that he was right. Now that was a man that had been through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sentencing, and it was my first. And what made the difference was how I charged the case. What made the difference was whether or not I filed the notice that was going to impose the mandatory minimum, and what was going to make the difference was what I was asking for there. Because the guidelines had shifted that to me. Now that's part of the problem, is that we do need to shift power back to judges, and that's going to solve both those problems. Can we make it translucent, that decision-making process? I don't think so, realistically. And I just don't see how that's going to happen, in part because the interplay between the investigator and the prosecutor is so important. And we can't have that be public, in part because the investigator doesn't want to make public the means of investigation a lot of times, for legitimate reasons. You don't want to know on the street how you're, for example, if you took my plan and you were tracing the money, I wouldn't want the investigators publicly discussing the way that they got to that, for example. I think that would be part of the problem. I think the prosecutorial discretion is a big part of the problem that we've had. The law has structured in a way to create that problem. We need to fix that. We have started to. I mean, what some of the people here have done has been tremendous in that way.
No, as a matter of fact, I believe Senator Biden, before he became vice president, had proposed a prosecution integrity bill where they would record the reasons for making decisions to show that there was no discrimination, and that got pushed to the side. And Rick Holder is supposed to have a couple of pilot districts now, having them document the reasons they make certain prosecutorial decisions or certain plea bargaining decisions in order to show that they're not discriminating.
I'll tell you one thing. I mean, there's always ways to evade requirements like that. And it's very hard to hold prosecutors personally responsible for things. But I think, personally, for me, the most important thing that I do and have done in terms of trying to create justice and viewing social justice, which for me is a faith issue, is teaching my students. I taught at Baylor for 10 years in Waco, Texas. All the criminal law students came through my class. 80% of them said they wanted to be prosecutors. And if they took one thing away from having me as a professor, I wanted to be this: am I solving a problem? Is locking this kid up for 10 years going to solve any problem? And if you are comfortable with that answer, then proceed. But let that be your filter. And I hope for some of them that's something.
So I just wanted to add to that, though. So Missouri has a very interesting experiment going on right now. They have on their website where judges, when they sentence a person, they have to put in certain key information about the characteristics of the person and also characteristics of the crime. And then they get a portfolio of what the typical sentence in that county that they live in is, and in the state of Missouri. And then attached to it is the cost of the different sentences that actually occur. So there are a couple prosecutors in the state of Missouri that are actually using that tool for them to consider what they think should be the right charging decision based upon some of the characteristics of the individual in the case. And I think that if we can think creatively, we can help re-norm the system in terms of people being able to think about, that basic question is, what am I going to get out of this? And is what we're getting out of this to the best of society's benefits? Because when judges see price tags costing $200,000 for an offender to go to prison, and the person's 20 years old, that's a big price tag to pay. And they begin to think that maybe there are other options. And that's what, the Missouri Sentencing Commission is working on.
As a matter of fact, there are a number of states now that are passing laws to reduce or allow for compassionate release and so forth, just because of cost implications. Where people got 20-year sentences, they say, well, they've served 7 years or 8 years, that's enough. And they're looking at the revenue impact, especially if that person has cancer or diabetes, they got strong medical problems, the compassionate release issues. And indeed, I saw another study that indicates that the United States had longer sentences, duration-wise, than any European country or any other country. Face it, our sentences are far too long for the nature of the crime. So we're taking a look at that issue. Yes, sir.
This isn't really a question, it's just an observation. I'll be short. What bothers me is today we had the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia here. He said, I really don't want to prosecute marijuana offenses, marijuana. And the question is, well then, why not write the memo? I mean, in terms of prosecutorial discretion, if he writes the memo, that will not be prosecuted. So, I mean, it's just really...
Write a letter to the editor of Washington Post.
Well,
and let the
but to me,
community
I mean, for him to come to this forum
Yeah.
and say that when he can actually implement it by writing the memo is just a little bit dissembling.
What would be equally effective in doing that too is to say that it needs the approval of the U.S. attorney to prosecute one of those cases. That would have the same effect.
Yeah, well, his thing was, is I don't want to do
No,
this,
he-
so why not
yeah, he
just
is
say,
the U.S.
I'm not going to do
Right,
it?
and that's what I'm saying, is that if that was the rule, it would have the same effect as
Yeah.
what you're saying.
Professor Kellerman?
Well, one of the themes that emerged from all of your comments is that our system has sort of devolved to what's easiest for people to be successful at who are workers in the system. So arresting people who sell drugs on the corner is, or has been up till now, really easy to do, certainly compared to burglaries. Probation was founded in the progressive era as a notion of social work to really enhance people's lives. And we went to the model of efficiency of the Industrial Revolution, a mass production in our criminal justice system. I think benefits was part of it, but it's mostly like showing success by revoking a bunch of people, showing success by arresting tons and tons of people and getting quick convictions. So, I guess I just want you to talk more about that, and to sort of talk more about that efficiency model. I'm not sure that your counter proposal addresses it, but I really am attracted to the idea. And let me just add one other sort of comment, which is, I like the public health thing, but if you look at Medicaid in particular and EPSDT, early periodic screening, diagnosis, treatment, those folks aren't doing anything for all the kids I see for the last 30 years coming up to when they reach delinquency. All these problems that you talked about, the health consequences, have been ignored by Medicaid folks for 15 years before the kid hits the delinquency system. It's palpable. But that's also efficiency, right? I want to show how many patients I can push through, and so I'm not going to serve them, I'm just going to push them through. So,
Just about that, I think that the law creates incentives for law enforcement. And like the 5-gram rule with crack, there was a huge incentive to build it up to 5.1 grams and then finish the case. I think that matrices of success are extremely important. And one of the things, and I didn't talk about this, I got some copies of the draft article out there, is that I think by saying seizing the money is what's most important, using that as a matrix, how much money do we grab?
Great.
I think that would be great. It would provide a great incentive for success that will be much more relevant than how many bodies do we have incarcerated.
and your test is solving the problem, which I like. But so far, the incentives are so strong to be quote-unquote successful that I think we need more strategizing from the experts, i.e. you folks, about how you change that matrix of success.
Yeah, I think that we all care about numbers, you know? And right now, what a lot of law enforcement people are told is what's your conviction rate and how many arrests you bring in. That shouldn't be the question, because that doesn't correlate to solving the problem. And that change has to occur at two different levels. It has to occur at the level of the decision makers, who are the prosecutors who have that discretion, but also in legislatures and in the administration. It's going to have to think in terms of incentives.
Yeah, Earth Sterling.
Well, can I answer the public health?
Oh.
So the issue with public health is that if we just go into our current system, yes, you're right, it's still an efficiency-driven system. But if you really take to heart the Affordable Health Care Act, we're talking about delivering health care where people are. So that's in schools. You know, schools have placed themselves in little boxes in the sense that they only do the education piece. But in fact, you know, a lot of kids get most of their meals in schools, particularly impoverished kids. So I think that if we really took to heart this notion, we could really do most of our preventative care, you know, beginning when in early childhood and carrying it through that period of time in which kids are engaged in those social institutions and schools. The other thing we need to think about as a country is that we have this professional notion of who delivers a lot of care. In a lot of third world countries, India, for example, which is not a third world country, but you know, they don't have enough mental health providers, but they have significant mental health problems. And so they've actually, you know, trained layperson to be first responders to help their community members. The same model goes on in Africa and other places like that, where you don't have, we don't professionalize things. And so I think we as a society need to take to heart that there are lots of jobs people could have in their communities.
Professionalizing it pushes the money towards the deep the rich people, so, yeah.
Right, and if you think microfinancing and all those things, we could really develop some of these communities that, haven't survived well since the 60s when the riots were.
Eric, I'm just going to observe that those of us, Jordan and Brooke and I, were on the first panel this morning, and I see that Ken Lammers, who was a panelist, was here first thing in the morning, and some of the members of the law review, and how glad I am that I stayed for the entire day. And I thought that the presentations I heard, here right at the very end of the day were also very, very interesting, very stimulating. I have sort of a question for Dr. Taxman. If you are familiar with the Hawaii Opportunity Probation Enforcement, if you could give us any comments you might have about that particular current tweak to sort of coerce abstinence in the probation system. And I wanted to take just a moment to talk with Mark. I absolutely loved your idealism. And aside from my infamy being involved in creating the $5,000, $50,000 mandatory minimums for the House Judiciary Committee staff, I also was Dr. Money Laundering, wrote the Money Laundering Control Act of 1986 for the House side. And I'm much less optimistic than you are that the cash can be stopped and that the financial institutions can be as easily penetrated. The fact that Gaddafi had $26 billion in a single bank says to me that he's not such a genius. It says that he's a moron because, in fact, there are thousands of banks to which, that those funds could have been dispersed around the world.
You think that's the only money he's done?
I mean, it may be pocket change, but I'd be surprised.
It's in that bank, but.
What's in others?
Yeah, what's in
Can I
others?
just respond to that before you go on? And that is that the phrase money laundering has come to mean a lot of different things. And as a prosecutor, one of the things that we had during that time was let's do forfeitures. Now I'm talking about forfeitures, but unfortunately forfeitures and money laundering under 1956 and 1957, which is what we're talking about, became something other than what I'm talking about. We're doing the easy cases, which is you take someone down, you take their house, you take their car.
Right.
And that doesn't make any difference because those aren't assets that are in the stream of cash flow going back to the after they're dead.
Right.
And so while people will say, oh, we already do forfeitures, we're not doing the forfeitures that matter at disrupting the business. In terms of, can we find all the money? No. And we can't find all the drugs either. One of the advantages, as I've said, of going after the money is if you find 21%, you've got a good chance of success in reaching that tipping point. And, there are ways to do it. We haven't tried. So.
Again, I appreciate your idealism in this. And you did frame this by saying, if we care about solving the problem. When you look, as you identify, how do you turn a 4-gram case into a 5.1-gram case, or a 50-gram case? 50 grams of crack is the weight of a candy bar. And I was struck when you look at the Sentencing Commission's data, about a third of all the crack cases are less than 25 grams nationwide. So it's clear that the department doesn't care about solving the problem. You made a reference. Why doesn't the Attorney General, why doesn't the United States Attorney make an order, issue a memorandum, say, I don't want to take marijuana cases? Why doesn't the Attorney General of the United States say, I am not going to allow any crack cocaine case of less than some quantity, or I'm not going to allow a cocaine case of less than X quantity, or unless you can show that there's so much money involved. In fact, there's no interest in doing that, is my fear.
Right, but part of the reason is because the matrix of success that we have is how many cases come in. And if that Attorney General does something like that, the result is going to be that all of a sudden we've got 1/5 fewer cases, and he has to explain that. You have to change the matrix of success first, and then act and measure success by that matrix.
Then you got the politics of soft crime.
I'll just simply say is that even when an effort is made to shame the Justice Department to take this seriously, they will not do it. I wrote a paper called Getting Justice Off Its Junk Food Diet. It was cited by the Vice Chair of the Sentencing Commission as he's cross-examining the United States Attorney representing the Justice Department at hearings on this. it is clear that the attorney generals collectively are not interested in solving the problem as far as they're not prepared to change the matrix. So I appreciate idealism, and I think that you're correct, but I don't think that that's the political dynamic.
It's a sad fact if the idealists in the room are the prosecutors and the jaded people are the advocates.
Yes, well,
and that may be part of the problem with this as a whole. I mean, I can tell you something, and that is that I never get invited to speak in Washington. I speak every place else. I testified in front of Congress, I guess. But there's a small circle of people who talk about this, both on the side of the Department of Justice and on the side of groups that constantly talk about it. And too often they talk to one another. The rest of us are shut out. And there does have to be an opening in terms of the discussion. I would challenge those of you that are part of these groups, that are absent groups. You do great work. This morning, I got up at 8 o'clock and went and met on another issue with Jody Kent, somebody who does great work in juvenile sentencing, and I've worked with for a while. I believe in absent groups, but there's too small a net being cast. When you have a panel that you have convened, if most of the people on that panel are from other absent groups in Washington, there's a problem. There's a big country out there. It's not flyover territory. It's where the people who make the decisions of who to send to Congress come from. And
but it wasn't the case with this law review symposium. They had people from coast to the other coast.
So can I answer though Eric's question? So the new kid on the block is this program called Project Hope out of Hawaii. What Hope is, it's a form, although they don't like to term it that way, it's a form of coerced abstinence and a drug court model for people who don't do well on probation supervision. They have a very charismatic judge, Judge Steve Ohms, who basically developed the concept, and there's a very flawed and terrible evaluation study that was conducted that has basically given life to this concept. And I could discuss it and why one should not trust that study. But I think this is symbolic of the problem of thinking that the criminal justice system will solve its own problems. This is yet again another back-end solution to try and deal with people who aren't doing well on probation. The reality is the average person on probation in this country has 13 conditions that they have to abide by. In the state of New Jersey, you can be on probation for life if you don't pay your fines and fees, which can be significant. In the state of Maryland, it costs $150 a month to be on probation. So if you are someone who have limited means, you can stay on probation until you pay that $150 a month. So, my attitude about the Hawaii Hope is, the nice part about that is that it closes the gap for the probation department and the judge for when people aren't doing well and having easy access to the court. That's the nice part. The unfortunate part is that it's cast in a coerced absence model, punishment, quick punishment, when we know the things that change people's behavior are positive incentives. And so the system does nothing to incentivize people to do well on probation. And Judge Ohms actually, the report and the public persona of his court is very different than he is in court. He's actually extremely impressive. He has taken to learning what's called change talk. So he's my example of a non-clinician who can actually motivate people to change. And, so he focuses a lot on people thinking about what's their role. Is this the image they want their children to see them as? Things that could actually encourage people who have the means by themselves to deal with some of their issues. So, Project Hope is just another fad going through the criminal justice system. It's very unfortunate that we can't really think about sort of other mechanisms, like reducing the number of probation conditions.
Thank you.
Two more questions, gentlemen here.
Mr. Henderson started off by saying that kind of the impetus for the crack cocaine laws were a fear of it was during a Democratic regime, and it was a fear they wanted to appear more tough on crime. And you Mr. Osler said that potentially what you tell your students is that they should always consider, if they're going to be a prosecutor, they should always consider what the goal is when they decide to prosecute a case. And I think that those two things are very hard to reconcile. Just to give you a little bit of background, I was a police officer actually in Missouri, in St. Louis, and it took me a long time to get to the point that you're speaking of, where you're talking about what is, when you determine, when you decide for yourself, you should know what the goal is every time you decide to arrest someone, every time you decide to take a case to prosecution. But I kind of disagree with you, Ms. Taxman, that the police officers, the prosecutors can't have a role in this when they are the ones who ultimately determine what the goal is. And if they can determine a goal that admittedly makes more sense, if they can serve that end, I think it could be a very powerful tool. And I just want to know how you reconcile those two, the political pressure versus versus the
goal. Yeah, I mean, I have to say that one thing I find often is that I'm defending the work that we do. I'm proud to have been a prosecutor. I did make a difference in a lot of good ways. And I'm proud of my students that become prosecutors as well, what they do. I think punishment is warranted for a lot of things. And not only, but more importantly, incapacitating some people who do bad things. I think doing forfeitures and grabbing money is a good thing. Now, part of the problem that underlies what you're talking about is, again, what's rewarded. The law decides that, and it tells us, as a police officer, what are you supposed to do? But still, as police officers, I mean, they've got more discretion than the prosecutors do in some ways. You go and respond to a call. You're in a domestic dispute. It looks like it's really nothing. You frisk people. You find some marijuana. You've got a lot more to do. You're going to make the call about whether you let that go or you take it in. That's a pretty huge decision in the end in the lives of those people. And those decisions happen time and time again. In terms of, is there the tension between what Wade Henderson said about the way these decisions were made, be tough on crime, and the decisions we have to make within law enforcement? And I'll tell you, if I was to go back, if I couldn't be a professor anymore, I'd want to be a prosecutor again. I'd step back into that job. You can do great good in that job if you do it with a sense of decent values and trying to fix problems. But tough on crime, part of the problem with that is consistent with what the others have said, is it comes from a sense of retribution. That we want to punish groups of people sometimes, or we want to punish a type of person. And that's where things get dangerous. It was the crack powder disparity came from 1986. Somebody today referred to Len Bias, what happened with Len Bias. I'm not going to recount that whole history, but you had, at the same time, Ronald Reagan signing the bill into law. You had Ted Kennedy and Tip O'Neill supporting it because people in Boston were irate about losing draft choice number 1 for the Celtics. That shouldn't be what is the basis for our most important societal decisions. We have to get away from retribution by anecdote, because that puts me in a bad position as prosecutor and puts you in a terrible position as police officer.
So just to respond, so the question is, if we put more resources into the police department, would it necessarily have to only be police officers? Because some of the best work that's being done actually for the mentally ill is, to have social workers who have, police officers can easily access when they find someone on the street and they don't want to make an arrest, but they know they need to basically deal with that person. And that's a resource that is not typically available to police departments. So one of the things I want us to think about, is that, we need police in our society, we need prosecutors, judges, the criminal justice system, but we only think within those specific roles of what people do. And one thing that's very difficult for organizational actors is for them to act outside the roles. So if we had augmentary staff like social workers who were in police departments then they would have easy access. And, you know, these are some of the looming issues that police officers face, is they can't just give people a voucher to go to a drug treatment program and know that the person can get in that day. Or if someone needs some mental health, you know, they can't just walk someone in someplace. There's lines, there's, you know, closed doors for lots of people. And that's what I'm trying to suggest, is that, you know, we really need to think much more about what are the nature of the problems that are driving, you know, disorder in our community. And it's not all about criminal conduct.
I want to say one more thing to follow up on what you were saying. That is, it is, as someone who teaches criminal law, having people who have law enforcement experience in class is great. I had one of my heroes is one of my former students, a guy named David Moore. And David Moore was a narcotics officer for various agencies in Texas for 16 years. I asked him to work on a case with me at great personal expense. If any of you saw the movie American Violet, that's him, Will Pack. And the Baylor professor, even though he's wearing a bolo tie, it's me. And he, like I said, he's one of my heroes because of what he did, not just in that case, but the person that he was, and thinking hard about how the system is supposed to work. And one of the dangers in this discussion as a whole is that I don't want to ever run the risk of demonizing law enforcement. That I do think that they are people of good faith, that they do want to do the right thing. They do want to solve problems. We have to give them the tools in the sense to do so, and we haven't done a very good job at it. But the last thing that we should be doing is demonizing law enforcement in any way, because they take great sacrifices. You know, you're getting paid $32,000 a year and people are shooting at you? We better do right by those people the same way you do right by teachers and people like that. And their voice needs to be heard in this whole discussion as well.
So it's actually 9 o'clock. Matt, anybody else here from the law review? Can you put this on and go to that? Go ahead. No, is that you? I think we answered all the questions. 9 o'clock, so I don't know where you're going.
I kind of went off too soon. Well, thank you so much for coming. It's been wonderful. I'm Layla Mansouri, the Symposium editor. Thank you for those who've stayed since the morning. And I don't know what else to say. Thanks to Laura for helping me, the rest of the board members. It's been wonderful.
Great job.
Thank you.